I'm Peter Keller. I'm the Vice President, Academic and Provost of Simon Fraser University. And the first thing I'd like to do this evening is to just acknowledge with respect the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, Quatsi, and Coquitlam peoples on whose unceded traditional territories we are gathering this evening. Now, it is really my great pleasure to not only welcome all of you, but to especially welcome our presenter tonight, Professor Wanda Cassidy, who will talk to us as part of SFU's presidential faculty lecture series. And most of you will know this already, but SFU has made it its vision to be Canada's most community-engaged, research-intensive university. And the President's Faculty Lecture Series, which is a part of SFU's Public Square, is very, very much a signature initiative of that vision. And so the idea really is, as part of this Presidential Faculty Lecture Series, to identify leading research faculty at SFU who will have a conversation about important issues of public interest. And of course, that's exactly what we're going to do tonight. Now, the way we're going to proceed is Professor Cassidy is going to give a presentation, and then there will be opportunity for you to ask questions and to offer comments. When you do that, I will ask that you put your hand up. I will then identify you, and then we'll give you a microphone. And the reason that we're doing that is that this series is being filmed and will be available on our SFU YouTube channel. And as you ask questions, we don't want to miss those on the filming. All right. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. What can I tell you about Professor Cassidy? She is Associate Dean of Graduate Studies in SFU's Faculty of Education. She's also an Associate Professor in that faculty. And she's co-founder and director of the Center for Education, Law, and Society. Hang on, it goes on for another page. So this center provides resources for educators and researchers interested in furthering legal literacy and law-related education by sharing research, curriculum, and professional development opportunities. Wanda's own research interests include the legal literacy of youth, cyberbullying at K-12 and post-secondary, and the ethics of care in schools. She's a frequent guest on local and national media, discussing education topics, particularly cyberbullying, and she has led numerous studies on cyberbullying in both British Columbia and Canada, and recently co-edited the book Cyberbullying at Universities in the International Context. And actually, there you are. So she's the recipient of the Isidore Starr Award from the American Bar Association Public Education Division for exemplary work in law-related education. And in 2017, Wanda's passion for education and her ability to establish a warm and welcoming classroom environment were recognized with the Simon Fraser University Excellence in Teaching Award. So we are very thrilled to have a talk this evening about cyberbullying in our schools and universities, extent, impacts, and solutions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wanda Cassidy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keller. My mic is working. I'm very honored to be asked to speak to you tonight. I'm particularly honored because this is a setting in the community, and I've always tried to make sure that my research has some kind of community impact. I chose the topic, I was given free range to choose my topic, and I chose it because it is still in the media, it still is happening in schools, and cyberbullying is also happening on our campuses. So I hope that my talk tonight will provide some research-based understanding of what is happening in our schools, and particularly looking forward to talking about some solutions that we might want to engage with. This is the overview that I want to follow tonight. I want to begin by talking about what is cyberbullying, the definition, what are some of the behaviors associated with cyberbullying, where does it take place, and then from there move to particularly talk about the K-12 situation, the school situation first, what is happening particularly student to student in cyberbullying, the extent, who's participating in it, who are the targets, why is it happening, what are the impacts, and how are students reporting it if they are indeed reporting it. Having done that, to give you a bit of a picture as to what's happening in schools in BC, I then want to move on to what is happening at universities. And unfortunately, cyberbullying is happening there too. I want to look at the studies that we've done that look at student-to-student cyberbullying, student-to-faculty cyberbullying, and unfortunately, faculty-to-faculty cyberbullying as well. And then to end the discussion with some solutions in terms of what our research participants have said, and also what the research itself says that seems to work to tackle this phenomenon. And then I'll conclude, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments. So, looking at the definition, it is really important that we know what it is and what it isn't. And so I'm using a very common definition here that is used globally, internationally, and we also used it in our own research. It employs information and communication technology to convey language and or images that can defame, threaten, harass, exclude, discriminate, demean, humiliate, stalk, disclose personal information, and or contain offensive, vulgar, or derogatory comments. Cyberbullying is intended to hurt or harm the recipient, and there's really three criteria that we look for in cyberbullying. It has to be harmful and unwanted, and there's almost always some sort of power imbalance, which I'll talk about later on as we get to describing how that works, and it is repetitive. Now, when you do face-to-face bullying, to be bullying face-to-face, it has to happen more than once to somebody. But in cyberbullying, the idea of repetition is a little different. A negative image can be posted online once, but circulated hundreds of times. So that's how the repetition fits in with cyberbullying. So those three criteria are really important to the definition. So what kinds of behaviors constitute cyberbullying? I won't talk about all these in detail given the time, but of course harassment, internet trolling, denigration of somebody's character in words and images, non-consensual sexting. Revenge porn is usually somebody who has some relationship with somebody. Pictures have been taken and then they're shared in negative ways to hurt that individual. Happy slapping isn't happy. It came originally out of the UK, where strangers would walk up to somebody, hit them, and somebody would film them on their camera phone and then post it. And everyone would have a good laugh, of course, except the recipient. So it's come to mean a little bit more than that, but it's negative images that are taken usually by cell phones and then circulated. And we see this happen in schools as well. Cyber stalking is probably fairly obvious. Exclusion is actually a form of cyberbullying. So it's not just the threats and the words and images that are posted, but it can be you're deliberately trying to exclude someone from a chat room, a Facebook site, and you're marginalizing them in that way. And it can be indirect threats. So it can be messages like, I might be a psychopath. I wonder if I'm a psychopath. Maybe we should meet later and you can see if I'm a psychopath. You know, so those kinds of indirect threats that aren't maybe specifically harassing somebody, but they're so implicit that it makes you really feel unsafe. Outing is another example. So outing could be outing somebody's sexual orientation when they didn't want to be outed, or outing in some other capacity. And also impersonation. So somebody representing either you online when you don't want to be represented, or coming at you with a different sort of image and pretending to be somebody that they aren't. And of course the venues that are used, I've just listed some of them here. And any opportunity in terms of internet, social media use, information technology is now used to cyberbully. When I first started studying this topic, it was mainly Facebook, MSN as well, even before that. And then when cell phones became more popular and so on, text messaging. And now some of them, I actually had to ask my daughter, who's 25, can you update me on some of these opportunities that people use to cyberbully each other? Because it's constantly changing. So what I want to focus on, as I told you before, is first what's happening in the school system. And I'm looking around, there's some families here, I'm sure there's a number of parents here. And so what is happening in the school system today? So what I'm drawing on here is 3 studies that I did in schools with my colleagues, Dr. Jackson from criminology and Dr. Fauché and Dr. Brown, who were also in criminology, and we moved Dr. Fauché over to, she now works in the Faculty of Education. And what I'm drawing on here with the data that I'm going to share is we worked in, over the 3 studies, 4 different school districts, 11 different schools. We administered student surveys, paper surveys, which really does encourage compliance and encourages a large sample set. We interviewed teachers and administrators in all of the studies, and in one of the studies we also did a parent survey. And we focused mainly on grades 6 to 10. Why do you think we did? It's because that's the age group that most of the cyberbullying takes place in the school system. And what I want to do, because my studies in schools ended a couple of years ago before we started then the university study, so what I want to do is show you, compare with some other newer studies that have been done in Canada and the US as well, to show how our data and our findings and statistics are very, very similar to what's happening today. So what is happening and what did we find from our studies? Well, this is the percentage of students who were involved in our studies that admitted to being perpetrators of cyberbullying. And this is the percentage who admitted to be targets or victims. So you'll see that in the first study, which took place in 2005, so a few years ago. So there's about 25% who admitted to being cyberbullying somebody else over the last 12 months of the school year, and 25% said they had been victimized. And again, we're looking at the age group of grades 6 to 10 primarily. By the time we got to the second study, about 4 years later, the amount of cyberbullying had increased. And you can see why, because the access to technology increased, the access to the internet increased. People had more laptops, they had more cell phones, they had more access. So that kind of behavior proliferated. And then the third study that we did just a couple of years ago in Vancouver Island shows very, very similar, I mean, not too different, but certainly even more victims. So 40% of kids in grades 6 to 10 in the recent study that we did from grades 6 to 10 said they had been cyberbullied by other students. That's a lot. Like when in the media we hear about a few that bubble up, the really serious cases, but really we're looking at many, many students are experiencing cyberbullying. Now, I told you I would compare with other studies. So there was a large study done by Wade and Barron in 2011, and they looked at several studies that have been done across Canada, and they found that depending on the study, the type of resources that were used, the perpetrators varied from 25 to 36%, and the victims from 18% to 50%. And no study is completely the same, so that's why if we had one instrument, one definition, the same age group, we could look at more comparisons. But this gives you a bit of a sample as to what's happening. The McCreary Society study, which is a BC study of all kids in British Columbia in 2016, they found that in the last 12 months, 13% admitted to cyberbullying. Now remember, it's more difficult to admit you are cyberbullying than it is to say you're a victim. So usually the perpetrator statistics are a little lower, and 29% said that they had been victimized. So again, a large population of students are experiencing this. And in the US, this was another large study. You can see the stats there. And then Patchen and Huguin looked at 35 peer-reviewed studies published in peer-reviewed venues. And on average, 18% admitted to being perpetrators and 24% to being victims. So I want to share this because I want you to see the extent of this phenomenon that's happening with our kids in schools. So who are these perpetrators and who are the targets? All right? You can be able to assume from what I've said in terms of the numbers, it is anyone and everyone. All right? A perpetrator could be the nice little sweet girl that gets straight A's and you don't imagine that she would do this type of thing. A victim could be, again, another popular jock, a boy who's very popular, but he might be targeted for various reasons. As I said before, the main age group is 11 to 15, and I talked to this family as I arrived, and you have two children, 11 and 12. So that's the age bracket where it's mainly happening. Now, when we ask kids in our surveys, who do you think is the victim of cyberbullying? This is what they said. Well, it's the kids that aren't popular, the kids with disabilities, the kids that wear unfashionable clothing, the ones who are either really smart or not so smart, the kids that look different from themselves. They thought that they were the ones that were being targeted, but in reality, that's not the case. It's those kids as well as many, many other kids. So one thing that bubbled up for us in those studies that I talked about in school was the role of gender. And girls are more likely to be both perpetrators and targets in cyberbullying. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as to why that is. And girls are harassed more because of their gender. Boys are more likely to be involved in face-to-face, like playground bullying, than cyberbullying. And if they are harassed, they're harassed often because of sexual orientation, or negative images are sent to them around sexuality. And in our studies, ethnicity, or sort of your background, and your socioeconomic status was not significant in our studies. It didn't bubble up. It seemed to happen across socioeconomic levels and also across ethnicity. In the States, they've come across some SES and racial and ethnic variation, but so far it hasn't really surfaced to a great extent in Canadian studies, and certainly did not in ours. So we've got a sense of the extent, we've got a sense of who does it. And what I didn't talk about in the last slide was the age group and why. So you could probably think about that period of time, that early adolescence where there's a lot happening, a lot of uncertainty about relationships, because cyberbullying is a relational issue. It does have to do with relationships between people. I'll come back to that in just a minute. So when we asked the perpetrators, why did you cyberbully? They came up with actually mainly relationship types of issues, right? The person upset them. They didn't like that person. They had been cyberbullied themselves, so they're cyberbullying back. And that's another really important thing to look at. There's a vicious circle. So if, for example, we're trying to deal with a cyberbully, the cyberbully is often the victim. So you have to look at the underlying causes. 9% saw their friends do it, so they thought it was acceptable. And unfortunately, 9% said it was fun. And so that's very worrisome. Fun to hurt people. But from the victim's perspective, overwhelmingly, they said, well, I don't know. I don't know, I just suddenly got this terrible message on Facebook. I suddenly had these terrible images sent to me, and I really don't know. So when we look at the theoretical perspective, because in research we obviously want to try to figure out not only what the perpetrators and victims say about why this is happening, but we also want to look at the wider literature and that we bring to bear in our discussion. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about this, but I think it's important that we understand. Overwhelmingly, the literature talks about power and control. So we draw on a power and control model from the 90s, which came out of domestic violence. So a partner in domestic violence attempts to control and have power over the other through intimidation, through exclusion, through emotional abuse, through all sorts of different venues that are accessible to that person. And this happens in cyberbullying. And the form of power isn't necessarily the type of power you might think. So if somebody has more facility with technology, then in a sense they have more power to bully somebody who doesn't. So you might have like a 11-year-old kid who wants to target a 16-year-old boy in the same school who's kind of big and obnoxious. If that 11-year-old kid knows more about how to operate technology, that person can have some power over the other to bully, which is the second point here called contra-power harassment. So it's a person that might not seem to have as much power, but obtains more power through different forms. And when we get to talking about university, another example would be students don't really seemingly have a lot of power over professors. Professors give their grades and so on, but they do have a lot of power in that they can post negative rate my professor sites. They can give professor terrible ratings for their evaluations and so on and so forth. So that's a form of contra-power harassment. Lack of empathy is also an issue that comes out of the literature. And people that write in this area, I don't particularly write in the empathy area, but the literature there says it's mainly boys that need to develop a greater sense of empathy for the other who's at the receiving end, and student incivility. So that's a literature that's just saying, look, the classrooms that we live and work in aren't the same as they used to be. There's not as much respect between students and between students to teachers. There's just more incivility. And then the final point is a really important theoretical point around relational aggression. So this is mainly occurring with girls. As I mentioned to you before, girls are more likely to cyberbully at the 11 to 15 age group. And it's mainly actually within their friendship groups, so-called friendship groups. And it's all about gaining power and control. So if you're an elementary teacher, I don't know how many here are, you probably know that, yes, a few. Girls kind of hang around in groups often. There might be 5 or 6 of them together. Well, often there's jockeying for power and positionality within there. Who wants to be the top dog? Who's the prettiest? Who's the most popular? Who has the most boyfriends or whatever? So there's a lot of that relational aggression that takes place. And that's one important factor that we need to look at in cyberbullying. In fact, I've got an example that came out of our data. I'm sorry, there's a couple swear words, but I'm going to read it out to you. This came out of 2 girls. It's an actual exchange, and it's only part of it. You backstabbed me about me so much. That was out of nowhere. You are such a bitch. Everyone's telling me that you hate my guts and you kicked me out of the group. Maybe you're just threatened by me, maybe because you know I'm way prettier. Yay, I'm really scared that I'm just an ugly bitch. Ha ha. Are you modeling from the shoulders down because your face isn't that pretty? Oh, how is it that CD you've been working on for the past years? Are they still working on making you sound like a human being and not a cow? You're a short, fat bitch with nothing to offer. I would rather die than ever look at you or be your friend. Haha, I want your body. Dude, your waist is long, like it never ends. You were born ugly, and you'll die ugly too. And that's only part of it. It actually got worse from there. And I was given it because it was a school that we were working with in our cyberbullying. So if you're at the receiving end or you're part of that discussion, in that case, both girls were at each other. But overall, if you're one of those 33%, 36% that are being targeted, what impact does it have on you? Now, we hear a lot kind of in the wider media, oh, well, get over it, you're just being juvenile, it's just part of growing up, like, just forget about it, just get on with your life. But in reality, it has very negative long-term consequences to kids. And when I get to the university, you'll see it's also impacting adults at university. These are some of the things kids talk about: depression, anxiety, having difficulty in school, wanting to quit school, have difficulty making friends, they feel unsafe, and several, of course, and we have heard of these cases, unfortunately, of suicide ideation. Females report more severe impacts at the school level, but not only are females impacted, and if you think about it, a third of the population being cyberbullied, that's a lot of kids. But it does affect the whole school culture. It's just not the individuals or the perpetrators, because that's also cyclical, but your whole culture is being impacted. Here's a couple of examples of the impacts from our studies. This is first is a female in middle school. I don't want to come to school. Friends think the cyberbullying, is cool, because person, my life is really bad. I feel bad about myself. Words hurt, but you can't stop them either. Now I know who I really should think of as friends. And this person who targeted her was a friend. This is a male one. I experienced a person who created a website about me and added sexual or related groups as hobbies and posted so many pictures of me that my physical appearance are hideous. Numerous writings of my personality that isn't true. It's really hurtful. So of those kids that were experiencing cyberbullying, did they tell anyone? And that's something that we like to find out, because if you suffer in silence, as 25% do in our studies, and this is actually quite a global statistic as well, then who do you talk to? It's very isolating. You're an adolescent. Who do you tell? So fortunately, 75% told a friend, but was the friend in the friendship group who was bullying them. So it's not like, who are their friends is one of the issues. But you'll see that only 57% told a parent and less than 50 told a teacher, and that's very age dependent. So if you're 11 or 12, you're more likely to tell your parent or a teacher, but if you're 16, you're less likely, for sure. And the reasons they didn't tell: fear of retaliation. So it's going to get worse. Some of my technology will be taken away. Adults won't help, or they won't understand, and nothing will change. And so in our studies, what we found that actually was quite shocking when we interviewed the school. We interviewed almost all the teachers in the schools in all of our studies and all of the administrators, and we would see an example of cyberbullying that you know about, and many of them scratched their heads and couldn't think of one. Or they would say, well, there was a really serious incident that happened. So generally it's happening under the radar of teachers. And even now we're finding, my studies are at K-12 are a couple years old now, and even though there's these anti-bullying programs in the schools, most of what's happening in the schools is happening where teachers don't know what's happening. And importantly, too, parents generally don't know. So in our study, only 11% of parents knew their child was a victim. So if you're suffering and you're coming home and you want to talk to somebody and you don't tell your parents because you think they'll take away your technology or restrict your access, and a parent doesn't know, like, there's a lot going on. And in fact, in that study where we did surveyed parents, one parent in the whole study knew their child had been a perpetrator. Only one, so less than 3%. Okay, so now that I'm kind of shocked you about what's happening at K-12, or maybe you're not surprised, I don't know, but I'd like to, if you could just kind of put that on hold, I'd like to talk about what's happening in universities now. And then towards the end, I'm going to do some comparisons between the two, because it's actually quite similar. How did we get involved in cyberbullying at Canadian universities? Well, how it happened, a couple of things. We were presenting with my colleagues at a conference, and a couple of people came up to me and said, have you ever thought of doing something at universities? I'm a resident head, and so much is happening in the halls, in university campuses. There's so much bullying happening there and cyberbullying. And funnily enough, both Margaret Jackson and I both got cyberbullied that same week. I was cyberbullied by a student in my distance ed course who I had never met, but really was very, very unhappy about the grade that that person was getting. And I got multiple emails, bold language, capital letters, all this kind of thing. And Margaret Jackson similarly too. So we thought, okay, what is happening? Do those cyberbullies, as they grow up and go to university, do they continue their behavior? Because if they're successful when they're 15, do they think they're going to be successful when they're 20, right? And so what is happening there? And also, because of the issues that we were encountering around gender issues, were there similar gender issues happening in cyberbullying? And then what was happening with our colleagues as faculty to faculty, because we had started to read about workplace bullying. So we were able to get a funding from SSHRC. And universities were very large research institutions. One was a large comprehensive university. I can't tell you if one was SFU, I'm sorry, it's confidential. And one was a college that had just recently become a university, so it was a younger institution, and these universities were in 3 provinces. So it wasn't, we had a 5th university at one point, but that university withdrew because it's kind of a complicated study. We did online student surveys. We did student focus groups, so we had students meet together and taped it and talked to them mainly about solutions. We did online faculty surveys, and we also interviewed a number of faculty members who volunteered at all the universities. We did senior administrator interviews, and we did a policy scan of all 75 universities to see if they had specific policies on cyberbullying that students and faculty members and administrators would know about. And what we looked at in our surveys and in our study overall was student-to-student cyberbullying, student-to-faculty cyberbullying, and faculty-to-faculty. Now there's obviously some things left out here, like staff are really important and where they fit in, and also we deliberately didn't ask for faculty-to-student cyberbullying, but some of it bubbled up. So I just want to give you a bit of a picture. So if you remember, I talked about extent in K-12. Let's look at extent at universities. Statistics actually us. Now, of course, we're just looking at those who filled out the survey. So when we did the K-12, there was paper surveys and the kids mainly all filled them out. So this is online, so you have to be kind of motivated to fill it out. But I did add, I haven't used this thing yet. Oh, I did add some comparison studies so you just see that, so just give you a sense here. So about 25% of people in our study, students, said they had experienced cyberbullying in the past 12 months, 12% by a friend or acquaintance, 14% by a stranger, so about half and half, and 2% by faculty, and only 5% admitted to cyberbullying others. As you get older, you're less likely to admit you participate in these kinds of behaviors, whereas when you're 11, I guess you don't know any better. But faculty, and again, about 25% of faculty said that they had been cyberbullied in the past 12 months, 15% by students, and actually 12% by colleagues. So the colleagues really actually surprised us a lot. And 0% admitted to cyberbullying others. I just showed a couple of comparison here. Now Japan just did a study. They didn't find very much cyberbullying between students, but they have a very I won't take a lot of the time to talk about it here, but they have a very rigorous system of teaching kids what behavior, young people, what behavior is appropriate and what isn't. They have to all go through certain courses in university, and it's just a different kind of society as well. And this Chile study was interesting because I'm not getting that little red dot. Well, the Chile researchers took our actual survey that we had done at university, the exact one, translated it into Spanish, and made a couple of little contextual changes and administered the survey, and they found even more happening in Chile than we did in Canada. And then among faculty, the book that Dr. Keller just referred to, we've traced some other contributors to our book. There's 8 different countries who are contributing. And in those countries, between 15 and 32% of faculty members have been cyberbullied, depending on the country. And faculty to faculty cyberbullying between 14 and 21%. This is a study done by Coyne and Farley in the UK. So it's happening. Just a quick bar graph to show you the differences between the 4 universities that we looked at, and you'll see that B, oh, my red dot, okay, I won't need my red dot then. University B, there's a lot more happening there. This is the university, I told you that it's a young university, just became a university from being a college, and there was, I think, a lot going on there, a lot of uncertainty, policies weren't really developed, but a huge amount of, in my estimation, of student to faculty cyberbullying. The other 3 universities are relatively similar, not that different. So, was gender a in university cyberbullying? Yes. It was a factor in a number of ways. Females overwhelmingly participated in our study, so it was voluntary. So both students volunteered and faculty. Most were females. Females reported more negative impacts like K-12, and females were more subject to sexting, virtual rape, and revenge porn. And this was different than K-12. Males were more often the perpetrators, and males and females were equally targeted. Females were targeted mainly by somebody they knew and by friends. Again, that relational aggressional issue. Males were targeted more by strangers, and in particular in gaming sites. And males were targeted more vigorously and viciously, not only in those gaming sites, but in other capacities. Females were targeted, in faculty again, females were targeted most often by, more often by students and colleagues than males were. And at University A, only female faculty members were targeted. Not one male member who responded to our online survey said that they had been cyberbullied. Only the female faculty were, and they were equally targeted by males and females. And by the way, most of those female faculties that were targeted by colleagues were in positions of authority and some sort of responsibility within the university. Was ethnicity a factor? I told you back at K-12, it really didn't bubble up in our K-12 studies, but it does bubble up at the university to some extent. It was a more important factor than age, length of university, or status. So if you've been at the university 20 years, or you're a full professor versus junior professor, or you're a graduate student versus an undergrad student, that's not as important as your ethnicity. So you're more likely to be targeted for ethnicity reasons. And males listed ethnicity as a top reason for being cyberbullied. And faculty members who were visible minority and their first language was not English are more likely to be targeted by students compared to those who are Caucasian or English as a first language. But they weren't targeted for their ethnicity or first language by faculty. So it was students that somehow sensed a vulnerability for visible minority faculty, particularly females, because we talked about that before, and were targeted more often. So why is this happening at university? Well, we asked participants why they thought it happened. So these are self-reports. So student-to-student cyberbullying, the perpetrators say, similar to K-12, right? The person upset them, person bullied me first, I'm going to bully back, and it was fun. And these are their top 3 reasons that they gave. So that fun element is still worrisome at that level. And the target, it was interpersonal reasons, and again, that don't know comes back. I really don't know why I am targeted. And their physical appearance. And those students who targeted faculty members said, the faculty member upset me, and I don't like their teaching style, I just don't like them. And I wanted to tarnish their reputation. And faculty members who were targeted by students said they were targeted for teaching-related reasons and their role or position at the university, and if they were female, their gender. And faculty to faculty, those who were targeted, the victims, said it was work-related reasons, it was gender, and it was for power and control. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, females who were in positions of leadership, if their decisions were not liked, so there was a power and control issue by colleagues that were cyberbullying them to try to gain back power and control or to make them leave their position. I just went into the associate dean role. I'm kind of nervously, Dr. Keller, in position of power and authority here, just kind of waiting for those, hopefully it won't happen, but hopefully not, but it is part of the literature, so. Okay, so back to the theoretical lens here. We look at what's happening at university in a very similar way. Power and control is fundamental to analyzing what's happening. Contra-power harassment, which I mentioned before, with students or people that don't have power and control, or let's say, in my role as associate dean, somebody really doesn't like a decision that I've made, so they're maybe more junior than I am, but they can make life extremely difficult for me. So they have a lot of power because I'm in a role of serving the faculty, and it can be very difficult for me. Not to use myself as an example, but I'm just trying to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Lack of empathy, again, comes at this level. Student incivility, relational aggression is important. And there's another literature here that's bubbled up that people have started to write about, is academic entitlement, where students feel that if they pay some money, a lot of money to go to university, that they're entitled to be treated a certain way, get the A's. You're looking at, yeah, this is some of my students over there and somebody who works at the university as well. And so if they don't get what they want, they will try their very best to do it by cyberbullying you. Here's a couple of examples again. Student-to-student cyberbullying. Called me a spoiled little rich bitch, mocked my bulimia in public messages to others on Facebook, messaged me multiple times telling me my boyfriend was cheating on me and that I was nothing more than a clingy bitch, slut, and loser. And student to faculty example, email, text message, was making comments that I was incompetent, not accessible, too slow, workload too difficult, and the words used were useless, lousy, I'm reporting you. Student was not open to feedback. I felt attacked and humiliated. And an example of faculty to faculty, a group of 4 faculty wrote emails indicating I didn't know what I was doing, yelling in emails, extreme rudeness, saying that I would go to the president. They would go to the president if I didn't do what they wanted. Very stressful. So we talked earlier about some of the impacts that students felt from K-12, particularly age 11 to 15. So what's the impact on adults at university? So the first column here has to do with student-to-student cyberbullying and what they felt and experienced as a result of being cyberbullied. So you can see that it affected their ability to do work. Right. So you'll see that it affected their ability to do work, their mental health, their relationships inside and outside the university. So I'm just categorizing. They listed a number of things, but these are categories. When we look at how faculty felt, you can see that the stats are a bit higher if they were cyberbullied by a colleague than students. So you'll see that those percentages a bit higher. And that's because the faculty members said in our interviews, in our open-ended responses that, well, at least the students were leaving after a semester or term, right? We didn't have to deal with them anymore. But with faculty, they're down the hallway from you. So you're part of the culture. So, many felt, you could look down here feeling unsafe. You just don't feel like you want to come to work. Several wanted to quit, like up to 50% wanted to quit as faculty members. And it certainly affected their ability to do the work, just as it affected the students' ability to do the work. And what we experienced, particularly in the interviews that we did with faculty members. Now, the faculty members that chose to be interviewed were quite severely cyberbullied, and they wanted to talk about it. And students as well in our focus groups. And what surprised, I would be sitting across the table from somebody interviewing them, and they would be sobbing. I mean, and this was like 2 years after the event. They just did not know why they were targeted, what it was about them, and the viciousness, both from students, but particularly from their colleagues, was really hard to take. So I just listed some of the things that they reported out, feeling. And coming down to the violent images, many of them said, sometimes I just want to get a gun. I just want to bully them back really badly because there's so much anger there. They just they can't deal with it. So there's not only a lot of self-loathing and feeling scared and all these kinds of things, not sleeping, but there's also a lot of imagery that came out when people described what had happened to them and the after effect. I'll give you a couple of examples. So here's a male student targeted by another student. Over Facebook, I was sent a personal message from a bully. Disclosed within this message was a death threat. They threatened that if I didn't stop coming to school and being who I was, that they were going to kill me. It was the scariest time of my life. And here's another example of a female faculty member targeted by a colleague. I have never experienced such intense hatred and perverse power manipulations. I was devastated by the message directed at me that read, "Ding dong, the witch is dead." I went into deep depression and 18 months of therapy. I doubt I will ever regain my confidence. My survival mode now in another academic unit is to remain under the radar. This person actually left that university and moved to another one. Like the K-12, unfortunately, it's underreported. So the vast majority told no one at the university, whether they be students or faculty. They might have told friends or family outside the university, but many remained silent. And similar reasons, actually. Fear of retaliation, fear the situation would escalate, lack of awareness of the policies, like what do I do? Time factor, it's so much work to try to deal with this. Also, particularly around faculty members, perception of being weak or incompetent. Well, you just can't cut it. Like, get a life. Like, yeah, we're all academics, but who cares? And belief, again, that nothing would change. And unfortunately, of those who did report, they were very unsatisfied with the results. So, am I okay for time? Just quickly, a few similarities. Probably are remembering this yourself, but similarly percentage of reported victims, although more at school from our studies. So about a third in K-12 and about 25% at university. Similar reasons were given for being a perpetrator and also being targeted. most people mainly know their perpetrator. It's not the stranger from the outside or the anonymous source. Many people know who it is that are targeting them. Power and control is very significant. This is what was really a finding that was really important, I think, in our study. The similar impacts were reported whether you were 12, 22 university student, or 42 professor, right? Age, very similar impacts. And strong gender patterns surface, particularly among females, but males as well, underreporting, fear of reprisals, and disappointed with results. So, with our study, both studies, is cyberbullying part of the online world, and we just have to get used to it. Like, this is just the reality of life, like we just have to do. When you ask kids this question, about half of them say yes. And this is actually very common result across the world. Is freedom of expression in the online world a right? And about half say that as well. Whoops. Okay, what do study participants say? So what are let's get to the solutions. And, okay, I can talk over that. So we asked our participants in all of the studies that we did, so what do you think the solutions are? We asked in focus groups and interviews, surveys and so on. Very, very similar results. They wanted more awareness, more education, strong anti-bullying policies, developed collaboratively with them, not imposed on them, better reporting, more support for victims, modeling good behavior, developing a kinder culture. So I just want to, towards the end, I want to talk about my belief is that we need a several-pronged solution. Like, it's not just one solution. It has to be pronged at all levels. So I just want to talk about some of those levels, and I'll quickly go over these slides because I want to give time for questions. The role of law and government does play a role. And you probably remember in 2015, there was a change to the criminal code that made it an offense to post or share intimate images of somebody without their consent. But those of us who work and research this area are quite concerned that there's a lot of limitations to that study. It's only images, so it's only images that are part of that criminal offense. And there's some sort of issues around enforcement and whether or not it'll be acted upon. But at least it is there, and it is a vehicle to be used. There's civil law, of course. You could sue somebody, but it's very often not done because it's costly. And in the various provinces, we now in BC have the WorkSafe BC, and the Ministry of Education has safe school legislation. But the law, Dr. Keller said I work in legal literacy. The law is a tool only of last resort, and it's a stick to enforce some level of compliance, but it doesn't necessarily change the attitudes. So we have to work at changing those attitudes. So I gave an example here of Australia because I think they're doing something really interesting that we in Canada should really look at. They've set up an Office of E-Safety Commissioner, and this E-Safety Commissioner manages cyberbullying that's happening. People can report to him or her. The commissioner, the office looks at what's happening, and they can actually make providers, Facebook or whatever, take down the material that any ordinary reasonable person would consider threatening, intimidating, harassing, or humiliating. And they have the power to do that, which I think we need it here in Canada. Technology companies do have a responsibility for what is being posted, and there's some pressure to do this. California's taken some initiatives in this area, but usually they're reluctant because of freedom of expression and the press and so on to do that. But we have to, I think, make it more of a public pressure to do so. Technology also plays a role in communicating resources and information about cyberbullying. And I've just listed 3 sites here. PrevNet is a really good site for cyberbullying and bullying information. I mentioned our Center for Education Law and Society, SFU. All of the articles that I and my colleagues have written on this topic are posted there if you're interested in the academic articles. And Government of Canada has a really good website as well. Australia, again, is I think they're quite progressive and far ahead in tackling cyberbullying. And they've got a really interesting app developed by one of my colleagues at the University of I forget now. She's a law professor in Australia, and they've done a really interesting app so that kids can just press an app and get some information and know what to do for reporting. Schools and universities actually have to develop policy. When we did our first study at schools, no school district in all of BC had policy on cyberbullying. It was just on bullying. And we worked with the Vancouver School Board. They developed some policy and they developed a manual, and it was circulated throughout the BC, and I understand that every school district now has a specific policy on cyberbullying versus bullying. I mentioned that we did a policy scan of 75 universities. That was a lot of work. And what we found was a whole bunch of different policies around all sorts of different things, but it was really hard to navigate if you were targeted, where you go for help. And I think my colleague Margaret Jackson is a policy analyst, and I'm conscious of the time, but I just want to say that I think in universities we need to look at ways. She talks about a policy roadmap. So if this happens to you, this is where you go for help, and this is what's going to happen, and these are the supports available to you. And I think we really need to look at that. Curriculum and programs also play a role in educating us about cyberbullying and countering it. And I do want to spend a couple minutes on this. It's really important. There's a lot of programs out there now that are coming into the schools, that are being used by educators, that are costing school districts money. It's really important that whatever is used in schools is based on research and not somebody's ideas. But I'm really also a strong proponent, my students know back there, that there's no one-size-fits-all programs. So these programs that are just brought into the schools that somebody else has developed, it might not fit your school. It might not fit your school district. It might just be developed, might have been developed in California or somewhere. Like, it's really important for us to look at what are the needs in my school, in my university, and how can I tackle it? And we need to engage everyone in developing those educational programs. And we also need to look at age and gender. So what's appropriate for an 11-year-old might be not as appropriate for a 16-year-old. And certainly gender, as we've talked about, is really important. So there needs to tackling relational aggression among females and empathy around boys at the K-12 level, and focusing on positive behavior. I got into researching cyberbullying because I was really interested in the ethics of care and creating positive face-to-face environments and positive online environments. So we shouldn't just look at anti-bullying. Let's look at how technology can be used to foster cyber kindness and appropriate, really respectful, caring online environments. Yeah, so what I want to talk about is the modeling. We can't have programs if we ourselves are not modeling the right behavior. You can't teach about respectful behavior when you're a bully yourself. Like, let's face it. So it's really important to do that. I'm really a big fan of whole school solutions where everyone is involved, parents are involved, kids are involved, educators are involved, everyone's involved, researchers are involved, and we're developing programs that work for that given school. And one thing overwhelmingly the literature says is that punishment is really ineffective. Okay, quickly, role of bystanders, that's another area that the literature is really starting to do some really exciting things on. Most cyberbullying takes place when other people are watching. Either other people have received the image and are forwarding it on, or they're watching that cell phone video being taped and circulated. But if bystanders start standing up and saying no, it's really effective. So what I wanted to end here is the most powerful teacher is not what we say, but what we do. And here's a quote from a chapter that we wrote just this last year. Unfortunately, cyberbullying behavior is endemic in the wider culture, practiced by too many teachers, parents, religious authorities, politicians, name will not be mentioned tonight, celebrities and other, I said to my colleague we should have a picture, celebrities and others who are in a position to mentor, influence, and guide our youth. So we encourage interventionists to take a macro or more holistic view of cyberbullying, to see it as a broader socio-cultural problem rather than just an individualistic or psychological phenomenon. So that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm a little bit over time, Peter.
Please remember that, and the first one there is, we get your microphone, and if you can wait until you get the microphone, that would be great. If you can get the microphone over here.
Sorry, I was a bit over time.
Not a problem, it's great.
Okay. Okay.
I recently heard about anonymous posting sites like Telenym.
Yes.
My grade 8 daughter told me that a message was posted on one of the boys' sites in her class to rate the ugliest girl in the class
Oh my gosh.
and the most annoying girl.
Oh.
And so what it made me think of is there's a diffusion of responsibility there between the anonymous person posting
Right.
and the person who is then answering the question. Do you know any research about whether that person who does the answering
Yeah.
sees themselves as a perpetrator, one, and if anonymous sites like Telenym
Right.
have resulted in an increase in cyberbullying?
Yeah. Oh, great questions. Well, the first one has to do with kids. I think people in general don't see themselves as cyberbullying. So when we ask the question, are you a cyberbully? We didn't ask that question. We said, did you participate in the following behaviors? So we listed some certain behaviors, and then we culminated those behaviors to indicate that it was cyberbullying. So I think that's part of it. Nobody wants to be labeled as cyberbullying, which is also an important role for education to play. Like, what is a bully? What is a cyberbully? And to get kids to engage with that and sometimes own it. And at university, I know you didn't ask this question, but university people tend to think of cyberbullying as something juvenile. Like it only happens with kids. It's not what I do. So I think that that's one issue. I think another issue is, yes, unfortunately, the more venues that are available, the more encouragement and opportunities there are for kids to cyberbully. And I think in the example that you gave, I think those people that are responding to that question, in a way, they're the bystanders. So they're participating, but they're not totally bystanders because they are participating. But there could be a group of those students to stand up and say, we won't participate in this and stop it before it goes any further. And that requires a lot of discussion in schools and classrooms. So like what I don't want to see happen and what is happening too often in schools is that there's once a week anti-bullying little workshop of some sort, whereas it really needs to be spread throughout the whole school always. I didn't have time to mention something that's happening in Finland, which is really interesting. They've got a program called Kiva that starts in even preschool, and it goes all the way up to grade 12. And they've seen amazing results, and it's being used now across the UK. And they really start to empower people, so they identify negative behavior, and they also start empowering and give bystanders the vocabulary to say no. So I'm really sorry that that's happened in your class. It's very hard for anyone who receives that kind of message. I hope that you can talk to the teachers and the principal, and because you don't want that to continue.
It's quite hard as a parent.
Yes.
So my child wasn't the recipient
Right.
of the bullying. And as a parent, when you hear that this is happening, there's not an easy venue of who do we tell here, right? And so I ended up, and my daughter said, "Mom, don't get involved."
Oh, well, that's often what the kids say.
So I sent a message to the counselor and I said, I want this to be anonymous. I'm still very concerned as
Right.
an adult about this. Imagine it was the same girl that was
Sure.
identified as the ugliest and most annoying.
Oh.
Right? And so my daughter said, don't worry about it. It happens all the time. And we rallied around this girl and said, that guy's an idiot. Don't listen to him, which I thought was great. So we had a conversation about bullying. But what concerns me is that I want a clear line of communication.
Right.
And an avenue for reporting.
Yeah.
From parents to schools, and that has not been communicated. At least for me as a parent, I'm not seeing clear communication of how do we as parents help to stop cyberbullying.
Well, if there's a way that you can work with your parent advisory group, I think so it's not just you need a group to go to the principal and start to say that you want this clear line of reporting. Kids really do want anonymous reporting because they're so vulnerable at that age, at 11 or 12, and they don't want to be considered the rat or all of those kinds of things. So, but parents if you take responsibility, I think something will happen in the school. But you have to keep pushing at it and send them my talk.
I will.
Okay. Any other?
There's a question over there. Let's come together.
Thank you for that talk. I'm just curious if there's any literature that points to actual retaliation. So there's underreporting because of fear of retaliation, but I'm curious in the higher ed or the K-12 context if retaliation is actually occurring as well.
There's quite a bit in the K-12 literature on kids suffering retaliation because, as I said before, the bully could have been the victim to begin with. That's a form of retaliation, right? So they were victimized and then they want to retaliate by bullying somebody else. So it can often become a vicious cycle. And that's not only in the cyberbullying literature, but in the face-to-face bullying literature as well. And I mentioned to you how even the faculty members at university felt like they wanted to lash out and be violent. The university literature is still very new. Like when we did our study, I think we were one of the first doing it at university, and so it's now just coming to the fore. So we don't know enough at the university, but certainly it does happen. But there's also that fear it will happen, and again comes to the adolescents, right? Everyone who is an adolescent wants to be liked so much, and if you're the rat or something, you're not going to feel like you're going to be liked. You want to be accepted. And so there's that fear. But I think you have a really good point. Does it actually happen? And unfortunately it does. Right.
In terms of solution, you said that punishment, that's not working. So I would like to hear what you have to say about the restorative justice approach. And based on the example of the situation at the School of Dentistry in Halifax at Dal University, that it was student-to-student cyberbullying, and it was dealt to a restorative approach. I think that lasts for almost a year.
Right.
So what's your thought?
Okay. I wish I knew more about the Dal. Like I would like to read everything about it. My knowledge of the Dal situation is what the media conveyed, so I don't know everything that went on. I can say that my immediate response to that Dalhousie one was there should have been some degree of punishment. right? So what I'm saying is punishment doesn't really work in and of itself, but sometimes when the cyberbullying is really difficult and it's done by adults who were very knowledgeable of what they were doing, I understand with the Dell situation, is that I'm not sure they should have been allowed to continue in their dentistry program. But I don't know enough to really make an informed opinion. I think at the school level, restorative justice can play a role if the victims are supported. Or I'm using the term victim, and I talked to a colleague of mine earlier about, and I know in the sexual assault literature, victim is not used always, it's survivor, but we still use it in the cyberbullying literature because many people still feel victimized as well. But I think restorative justice can work if the people at the targets have the support and they're not, again, it can be a power and control issue, right? So you have to give them somehow equal power to share what's happening. I'm a big supporter of curriculum that is case studies, but that aren't necessarily based, they're based on real cases, but they're not the real cases that the school is dealing with. So there's a step away from the actual issue so people can talk more freely about the situation. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Cassidy,
Oh, yeah.
for your presentation.
Hello,
Something
Christina.
that struck me hi, was I'm wondering if part of the education should be around sexism and homophobia, because I noticed that since girls, I mean, you talked a little bit about social development of young girls, but then at the university setting, it was still females doing it to females
Right.
more, and also female faculty were targeted more. So I'm wondering how much that keeps sexism in place when we have women, or girls targeting other women on standards that are not set by women around beauty, intelligence, all those things. And then also when boys or males are targeted in ways that are around like sexual identity. And so I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, it's all tied together, isn't it? I mean, it's not, I just had a little bit of time to deal with some solutions, and I kind of would have liked to spend more time on it. But yes, I mean, even sexual assault is tied in with cyberbullying or sexual violence of some sort. I mean, they're really interconnected. And one of the chapters in our book, it was written by a graduate student here at SFU in criminology. Her research is on LGBTQ targeting and cyberbullying. And so, I mean, yes, those groups, not only females, but I guess anyone that's perceived of being somewhat vulnerable. So when I talked about if you were of a visible minority, didn't speak English as a first language, and you were female, that intersectionality of vulnerability comes into play, or if you're LGBTQ and maybe have a disability, or all of those opportunities that people sometimes have to target others, especially those who think it's fun. There's that element in society that really doesn't care. I mean, they somehow go online and enjoy or what they do. So yes, it's complicated, but I think we need to have these kinds of discussions all the time, not only at university, but in school and in the wider society. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what we're going to do. Let's figure out what we're going to do at SFU, and other institutions as well. So it's a wider, that's why I'm saying, I tried to end the slide, it's a wider problem. It just isn't an adolescent problem or a female problem, but it's all of our problem. It affects our environment. It affects, when I turn on the news, I sometimes feel ill because it's, there's so much bullying behavior, and I'm thinking, we have these programs for kids in school, don't bully, but you see it all the time. So the most powerful teacher is what we are modeled to others. So we need to start, I guess, grappling and grabbing hold of these issues and deciding what kind of society do we want, and how can each of us play our role in making it a better place. Like each of us does have a responsibility. Each one of us has a voice. Each one of us has a degree of power. So let's step up and hopefully do that. Come on.
Two questions at the end and the third one. Second one.
Who's?
We'll work our way out there. Start there.
Okay. Oh, thank you for asking me a question. Do you want to start? Yes, sure.
So,
Hold on.
social media websites, they have access to all of our emails and our text using certain conditions. If they have all of this bounty of information, how come they aren't doing any sort of action to prevent all of this?
Right. Yeah, good question. There needs to be pressure put on them to start to behave more responsibly. And right now, they're big corporations, they have a lot of money, they argue freedom of expression, and there needs to be put a lot of pressure. That's why I gave the Australia example, if you remember. So Australia has this bigger body that if there's a problem happening with Facebook, for example, or Twitter or whatever, you can contact them, they will look into it, and they will make Twitter or Facebook or whatever take down those negative images or messages. So I think in Canada, I mean, young people have a voice, right? So you could start a real movement in your generation, you know, to start writing letters to the Prime Minister, write letters to whomever. You know, children have a lot of power. Okay, that was a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you also for the excellent presentation. And my question has two parts.
Sure.
And they're related to how the social context affects behavior
Right.
or is related to behavior. And the first one is, did you look at any differences between faculties within a university, like are some faculties more prone to this behavior than are others, is the first part.
Yes, but I think that's another study. We did collate everything together in our studies, but I could give you an example of the 4 universities, right? So of the 4 universities that we looked at, the one had a lot more happening. And there was a lot of negativity. Even when I went to do the study there, I went to get permission. They didn't want just to do it by paper. And you'll laugh at this, Dr. Keller. It was a very long room with a very long rectangular table. And the vice president sat at the one end of the table, and I was asked to sit at the other end of the table. It was like unbelievable. And I was grilled around, you know, what the purpose was, why I was choosing this university. And I was because there was colleagues there who wanted to do the study at that university. And they were willing to take it on from their point of view as collaborators, but they had to bring me in, and it was unbelievable. And this person was telling me that there was absolutely no cyberbullying at that university, so why was I doing it? Would I make them look bad? And so I wasn't surprised if that's happening at the top. There obviously was some kind of culture of fear happening, or power of some sort being conveyed. And so when that university bubbled up as having more student and faculty cyberbullying, I wasn't that surprised. But I think every culture, every faculty is very different, and I think we all have to work on making it better places. And John Driver from SFU wrote a small chapter in this book, and he called it kind of How to Deal with Bullies. And he wrote it when he was vice president academic, which was the position that Dr. Keller is in now. And he just talked about how, in his experience, in his role, he's met a lot of bullies who are academics, and how you have to deal with them right away, and how some areas are more difficult than others, for sure. unfortunately. Our Faculty of Education is pretty good. We've got our new incoming dean coming here, Susie O'Neill. She's awesome. But we all have to play a role in creating a better place for sure.
Part two related
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
the K-12 system, and I know there are some private schools that have particular philosophies
Yes.
related to kindness and
Right.
support for each other. And do you know of any research and the extent to which that environmental context?
Well, one of our third study that we talked about, maybe a bit or not. So one of the schools that we did a lot of research in was a private school. And they had all those accolades, but there was just as much bullying going on. It's just that you could have the accolades, but unless you start to sort of grapple with what that means to play it out, because sometimes those accolades are for the parents. This is the kind of school we have. We're kind, we're considerate, we're responsible, we're good citizens, but it doesn't actually play out in the reality of what goes on day by day. And I'm really a supporter of opening, let's having these dialogues with kids so that they feel free that they can say, yeah, I've cyberbullied somebody, right? And why did I do it? And really sort of open that dialogue and not be afraid to look good from the outside, which is often the case. I could tell you lots of stories, but I won't, about experiences in going into schools and giving them our data, and they don't want to hear it because they think it's going to make them look bad. We actually had at one school, it was one of the schools in our study, there was, the whole faculty was there. It was a large secondary school. There was about 100 plus faculty members there. And we were presenting our findings from that particular school. We'd aggregated out those data for that particular school and talking about it. When we got to the impacts of the kids, the vice principal came up and said, time's up. And we'd only got about 15 minutes into our 40-minute presentation. Very loud voice, time's up. And we're like, no, you gave us 40 minutes. Walked to the front of the room, said in a really loud voice again, time's up, and then actually pulled out our technology. And said, time's up. We have to move on to other agenda items. And we ushered ourselves out. So not everyone wants to know what's really going on in their school, but we need to know to be able to deal with it. And I bet that school had bought one of those expensive programs and said, we have an anti-bullying program in our school, everything's great, right? But it wasn't great. It was happening under the radar of what was happening in schools. So.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah. Oh.
My question is kind of long, so I just read it. Thank you very much for this great presentation. In telling, listening, and reading of critical stories, we can create opportunities to make sense of complex subjective realities and develop strategies for change. We can use the stories to describe our experiences of particular social phenomena and to connect with others and to share commonalities and differences. Do you think it's useful to use narratives in form of stories or critical stories in a safe and inclusive space, of course, as a methodological tool to enhance and expand our understanding about cyberbullying and nonviolent aggression, and of course, kindness? And do you think these very raw and real experiences can allow us to have a better sense of affective and emotional impact of cyberbullying, the kind of impact that sometimes is very difficult to capture or even articulate? Thank you.
Thanks, Samaya. Absolutely. I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher. I do stats, but I basically love qualitative research because it allows the voices of the participants to come forth in stories. And it's a story that they need to tell. So the interviews I talked about with the faculty members who shared our stories, some of whom were crying, it was really important for them to tell their story to somebody who was listening and somebody who wanted to hear it. And and they felt that their story was going to go somewhere and make a difference somehow. But I think also other people who read other people's stories also are impacted by that. And they think, it's not just me. I'm not the only, so the kids that's suffering in silence, they think, or the adults suffering, they think it's only them. So once you realize that there's many other people sharing the same thing, there's a camaraderie that's created, and I think is empowering for the individuals and for our society. So I think we need to tell more of those stories as well. So thank you.
I hate to cut the questions off, but the good news is that we're actually going to transition into a bit of a reception in a minute, and so that we have a lot more opportunity to continue the conversation and to ask some more questions.
All right.
But let me start.
Oh. It's your turn.
Let me first, on behalf of all of you, really want to thank you for sharing your insights, but really also thank all of you for coming out to participate. It's, I think, really, really important conversation.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So as the engaged university, of course, I have to now do promotion about a whole pile of other events. But before I do that, none of these things would ever happen without some really sort of a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes. And so just a shout out to Katie Wong and to Zoe Lee from SFU's Public Square for making this happen. So thank you. If you're not doing anything on March the 14th, it'll be the next President's Faculty Lecture. It'll be held in Vancouver, and it'll feature our sociology professor, Anne Travers, and she will speak about approaches for understanding and supporting transgendered kids. I also do encourage you to go to the SFU Public Square website for other upcoming events, and one of them is our 7th annual Community Summit, and that's going to run from April 10th to 18th, and it's entitled Confronting the Disinformation Age. And that summit will explore how proliferation of disinformation is impacting society and challenging citizens' ability to make informed decisions about their economy, and their social and their political lives. So I think a pretty important conversation to have. So again, I encourage you to go to the SFU Public Square website to check out all the details, and hopefully you can join us at that forum. So with that, as we transition into the more informal reception, thank you for being here tonight, and a safe journey home.